Hi, good afternoon, everyone. We'll just wait about 1 minute to allow folks to jump in, and then we can get started. Okay, great. I think we can get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our final webinar from the Asthma Awareness Month series. My name is Stephanie Espinal. I'm a Health Promotions Manager from the New York State Children's Asthma Initiative, a joint initiative of the American Lung Association and the New York State Department of Health. Before introducing our speaker today, I'll just review a few pieces of logistical information. All lines are muted and all cameras are off. And if you have any questions, feel free to write them in the Q&A box. So right at the top of your Teams screen, you should see a Q&A section right there, or you can also write them in the chat. And we'll review after the conclusion of the presentation. We'll have some time set aside for any questions that you may have. So please feel free to write as many questions as you'd like. So today's webinar is regarding the impact of climate change on asthma, and it will be presented by Dr. David Hill. Dr. Hill is a practicing pulmonary and critical care physician with Waterbury Pulmonary Associates in Waterbury, Connecticut. He is an assistant clinical professor at both the Yale and Quinnipiac University Schools of Medicine. He is chair-elect of the National Board of the American Lung Association, chair of the Public Policy Committee, and a national media spokesperson. He has been a principal investigator for more than 75 clinical trials, many of which are focused on asthma therapies. And with that being said, Dr. Hill, it's an immense pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for this webinar today. I'm really looking forward to it. So I will pass it over to you and I will share my slides.
Great. Thank you for joining us for this call. And I'm just going to wait for the slides to come up. Perfect. So we're going to be talking about the impact of climate change, specifically on asthma. I'm going to talk a lot about climate change in general, and we can go to that next slide. I always like to start a talk with a conflict of interest statement. I do a lot of clinical research. I have no conflicts regarding this talk, although I do have interest in conflict when it comes to climate change and health. That's my children, my patients, and my work with the Lung Association all make me a fierce advocate regarding this. Next slide. So our objectives today, we're going to review the basic scientific evidence regarding climate change, which can be a controversial topic. We're going to discuss the effects of climate change on temperature, on specific air pollutants, and on allergens. We're going to talk about why these changes are important for patients with asthma, and we're going to review appropriate actions that we can take as a society and that individuals can take to mitigate the effects of climate change. Next slide. So these are the big 5 facts about climate change. Scientists agree that it's happening. It's real. It is being caused by humans. It's a bad thing, but there's hope. And that's shared from my colleagues at the Yale program on climate change communication. Next slide. So why is this occurring? This is a relatively simplified slide, talking about the greenhouse effect. The sun, that large yellow ball in the left upper corner, provides heat and light to the Earth. Some of that is instantly reflected by the atmosphere and goes back out into space, but a lot of the radiation is absorbed at Earth's surface and contributes to warmth. That heat should be radiated back out into space, but when we have certain gases in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, methane, other gases, heat is reflected back to the Earth and the Earth gets warmer, which is known as the greenhouse effect. Next slide. So this is not new knowledge for us in the scientific community. The first suggestions that climate change could occur date back to the 1890s. A Nobel Prize winning chemist, Arrhenius, described how halving atmospheric CO2 would decrease the greenhouse effect and lead to an ice age, and doubling it would lead to an estimated increase in global temperatures of 4 to 7 degrees. This was all based on theoretic science, not on actual measurements. Science always gets better. In the 1950s, Plass described that doubling the amount of CO2 would increase temperatures by about 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. And in the 1990s, Keel described that CO2 accounts for about 25% of the greenhouse gas effect in the atmosphere. Next slide. So we've been talking about climate change that I can remember since the late 1980s when I first started hearing about this, and even I may have been slightly skeptical as a young man. The initial observations of increasing CO2 level occurred somewhat accidentally at the Mauna Loa Observatory, and for the first few years they were measuring CO2, they weren't even sure if what they were finding was real. But you can see from this graph, there's been a steady rise in atmospheric CO2 levels over the past 60 years, and unfortunately, they continue to increase. There are seasonal changes that occur, so CO2 levels are higher sometimes a year than others, but the overall trend is continuous and upward. Next slide. We also have measurements of CO2 over the past 1,000 years. Now, some of you may be saying, wait, how could we know what CO2 levels were in the atmosphere in 1400? Scientists are smart, so they use drills and dig down into the ice in the Arctic, and they can actually get measurements of what the gases trapped in that ice are from 1,000 years ago. And we can see that CO2 levels in the atmosphere were remarkably stable until the Industrial Revolution, when we started burning fossil fuels. And then they have steadily risen, and more recently that trajectory has increased even more. Next slide. What this translates to is increasing temperatures. So this graph is known as the hockey stick graph because of the shape on the right-hand side, and shows estimates of temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere, again, over the past 1,000 years. The early data on this slide is based on tree rings, tree growth changes based on temperatures. It's based on measurements from those ice cores. It's based on fossil coral growth. And then at the latter end of the curve in red are historic and observed temperatures that were recorded. And we can see global temperatures remarkably stable. And then over the last couple of hundred years, an abrupt rise. If you look carefully, you can see some drops in temperature across this graph. Some of that has to do with deforestation leading and then forest regrowth leading to carbon being absorbed. Next slide. So climate change specifically is an issue, but it's a real issue when it comes to respiratory health. And this is because changes in climate and temperature and other factors will directly promote or aggravate lung disease. It increases exposures to factors that cause lung disease. Those main concerns are asthma, which we're going to focus on today, but also COPD, allergic rhinitis, lung infections, and lung cancer. And the groups at highest risk for this are people who have known heart or lung disease already, extremes of age, so very young children, and the elderly, and marginalized communities who are more likely to be exposed to poor air quality. So the poor in general, people of color, migrant communities are all at higher risk. Next slide. Temperature itself is dangerous. So the picture here is just of a weather report, and this is becoming all too common in summer months with high temperatures in triple digits, and in some parts of the country, high temperatures of over 110 degrees Fahrenheit during heat waves. And high temperatures alone are deadly, particularly for people who already have heart or lung disease and the elderly. Again, particularly for people who can't get away from it. So if you don't have access to air conditioning, heat can be a deadly phenomenon. When temperatures are over 95 degrees in first world countries, there are 40,000 excess deaths based on the temperature alone. Next slide. Temperature and air pollution also go hand in hand. So the higher the global temperatures are, the higher the number of hazardous air days. This is due to increases in both ozone and particle pollution. And it also is directly related to the effects of climate change, such as forest fires and desertification. Next slide. So ozone is a chemical that is formed by the reaction of volatile organic compounds, which are called VOCs, and nitrogen oxide in the presence of sunlight and heat. So the hotter it is, particularly when it's sunny, the more ozone there is. The volatile organic compounds can be naturally occurring and can also be the product of combustion, such as automobile exhaust. The nitrogen oxides are also from automobile exhaust and other industrial processes and chemical processes. Next slide. So ozone, you may recall, is a good thing when it's in the upper atmosphere. Ozone blocks certain radiation from coming to the Earth. We had a major issue with a hole in the ozone layer 30 years ago, and the scientific community and world governments got together and have actually addressed that. It's a great example of how we can take an environmental problem and fix it when people are willing to act on it. Ozone's great up in the stratosphere. Down at ground level, it's bad. And it's bad at ground level because being exposed to ozone leads to increased airway inflammation and airway reactivity. It can actually cause people to develop asthma. It's associated with increased emergency room visits, hospitalizations, and premature death in patients who have asthma or heart disease. And the number of ozone red alert days is increasing because of global warming and climate change, and is estimated to increase by up to 70% by 2050. Those hazy, hot, humid days are when we see spikes in ozone pollution. So that's what you need to watch out for. It's the air pollution we call smog. Next slide. Climate change also increases exposure to particulate matter. All right, it increases that because both natural and man-made causes of particle pollution increase due to climate change. We all remember the wildfires from last year and happening out west again this year. We also get drought, change in land to desert, and that leads to increased particles from dust. Next slide. When it comes to particles, size matters. So beach sand is a small particle, but it's too big to be inhaled. Human hair, and some people will talk about being allergic to pet hair. Actually, hair is too big to be inhaled and cause problems. When you have problems with pets, it's usually due to their dander or to chemicals in their saliva that attaches to their dander. It's smaller particles that cause the biggest problems. So PM10, things that are 10 microns or less, include things like dust and pollen and mold, which can cause allergies. PM 2.5 are even tinier particles, usually caused from combustion, burning fossil fuels, also from certain organic compounds and metals, and those particles are small enough to get deep in the lungs where they can cause problems. Next slide. The health effects of particle pollution are well documented. So acute exposures lead to decreases in lung function. They lead to exacerbations of respiratory disease, specifically asthma or COPD. And again, we see increased hospitalizations and deaths. Long-term particle pollution exposure is associated with both heart and lung disease and increased heart disease, strokes, and lung cancer deaths. Next slide. Populations at risk, and some of this may start to sound repetitive. People who live or work in high traffic corridors or near industrial facilities. That again tends to be people who are poor and people of color, because most of us choose not to live directly next to a highway or next to an industrial facility because of the noise and the pollution. Other people at risk are those whose work requires them to work outdoors. So if you are a landscaper or a highway worker or a construction worker, you don't necessarily get to choose to stay inside when air quality is poor. There are also people who are at risk from sensitivity. So people who have allergies or asthma are more likely to be affected by particle pollution. Again, the extremes of age, the elderly and young children are at higher risk, and those with asthma and allergies are specifically at higher risk. Next slide. Mentioned wildfires earlier. Those of us on the East Coast remember June of last year when a huge swath of the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic had horrific air quality. The West Coast has faced this year over year. There are large fires burning in Canada already that are starting to affect the US. The nature of this is that with climate change, increased temperatures, changes in weather pattern, we're seeing an increase in the number of large fires, an increase in forest fire frequency and intensity. These fires have a nationwide impact, and they don't respect any state or international border. The smoke can travel thousands and thousands of miles. When I first gave this talk, I talked about how wildfire smoke was described to travel 1,000 miles. We now have seen effects that travel 3,000 to 5,000 miles and affect air quality across the country. There is some evidence that the particle pollution from wildfires may be actually more harmful than some other particle pollution due to the organic compounds in it and a reactivity that it leads to in lung tissue. Next slide. On the opposite side, naturally occurring changes such as change in pollen production also are a direct effect of climate change and can specifically affect people who have allergies and asthma. So both ozone and particle pollution decrease the amount of pollen needed to trigger asthmas and allergies. This happens because the airways get inflamed from the pollution directly and then are more likely to be reactive. Some particle pollution will actually attach to pollen and make it more allergenic and make people more likely to react to it. Climate change itself is affecting pollen because of increased plant growth rates, increased pollen production by plants, changes in the pollen protein that make it more allergenic, longer pollen seasons, increased range of plants that are allergenic, and increased distribution of those plants. Ragweed season in the Midwest is already 30 days longer than it was 20 years ago. Next slide. So these graphs show current tree habitat distribution across the mid and northern southern states on the East Coast. And on the right side is an estimate of distribution changes when we have climate change. So you can see the Midwest, where it's bright red, there are going to be a lot more tree allergies related to changes in growth patterns. There's also a swath that moves up across the Mid-Atlantic and right into where I live in Connecticut, where there's forecasted increase in pollen production from changes in trees. Next slide. This is a slide of birch season start dates actually in Europe, but it's seen similar across the Northern Hemisphere. As you can see, this is the start of birch season based on days from January 1st. And if we go back to the 1970s, it was 100 days into the calendar year before birch pollen started to come out. In current days, it's decreased by a good month. So people are starting to have tree allergies earlier and allergy and asthma symptoms related to that earlier. Next slide. The other allergen that is specifically related to climate change that we need to be concerned about is mold. And mold growth is enhanced by moisture. So in some places we see drought, fires, and desertification. In other places we see extreme weather with torrential rains, floods, hurricanes, and rising groundwater, all of which can lead to increased mold growth. Mold tends to grow better at higher temperatures and with higher humidity, and an increase in plant growth and leaf litter leads to higher mold growth rates and increased allergies and asthma. Next slide. So what do? There's not just a simple switch we can hit and say, let's control the climate and make things better. Next slide. So there are some general approaches. Some of these are things people can do individually. A lot of changes require organized efforts at both local, regional, national, and international levels. In general, we need to move away from greenhouse gas use. That means we need to burn less fossil fuels. We need to change our industrial processes so that we're not using fossil fuels to manufacture fertilizers, so that we're not releasing fossil fuels such as methane through agricultural or industrial products. We need to do what we can to decrease air pollution, which means putting appropriate controls on power plants and changing over the type of vehicles we use for transportation. And it means converting to green energy. We need to constantly talk about climate change as the public health crisis, which it is. This is not simply about temperatures rising. This is about people becoming ill and dying because of the effects of climate change. As I said, we need to choose and promote green energy. Sorry. Oh, you can all hear me again. We need to choose and promote green energy. And some of that also means we need to just use less energy. So when you can walk or bike to get somewhere, that's better than getting in a vehicle. When you can use public transportation as opposed to an individual vehicle, that's better for the environment. We need to promote green spaces because in general, more plant growth is good for decreasing air pollution within the limits I mentioned about pollen and mold. We need to eat less meat. Agriculture is a prime driver of greenhouse gases, and the more energy it takes to produce calories, the more greenhouse gases are released. I'm not suggesting that everyone needs to be a vegetarian, but the less red meat we eat, the less climate change there will be. We need to communicate with others. So we need to talk to policymakers. Need to talk to colleagues. We need to talk to friends and family and have conversations about why this is important and why we need to take action. Next slide. So the benefit of pursuing mitigation efforts and limiting the effects of climate change come down to healthcare effects and dollars saved. In 2023, there were 28 climate-related disasters in the United States that each caused over $1 billion. We are seeing severe storms that are being driven by climate change, which have caused billions of dollars of damage and caused people to lose their lives across the South and Midwest. We're seeing wildfires in Canada already. In terms of transitioning to zero-emission vehicles will lead to 2.8 million less childhood asthma attacks and over $1 trillion in healthcare benefits including decreased premature mortality, decreased asthma attacks, decreased lost work days, decreased use of hospitalization and ER visits. So this is a process that not only will help clean the air and decrease climate change, but it will save lives and save healthcare dollars. Next slide. So what specific things can we do as individuals? We need to support green legislation. The clean car and truck rules, which the EPA has proposed, we need to support and tell our policymakers that we need to follow through with them. We need to support air pollution controls at industrial facilities and power plants. We need to support investment in green infrastructure so that as we electrify, we can provide appropriate electricity to support that. And we need to do that both at a national level and at a state and local level. So changes in zoning, changes in local laws and state laws can help drive this process. We truly need to limit oil and gas exploration and production. We can't afford to continue to burn fossil fuels. That process needs to stop, and the sooner we can transition, the better. We need to promote and support public transportation, which is more efficient, and that requires investment in appropriate infrastructure. Some of climate change and the pollution-related effects we're not going to be able to avoid. So we need to redesign our buildings and our landscape to be heat and pollution tolerant. And we need to support robust local warning systems so that people are aware when air quality is bad and when temperatures are high, and that they have places to go to be safe. Next slide. So what can individuals do? And I call this a call for awareness and action. Number one, you personally want to pay attention. Specifically, if you have asthma, you want to be aware of your local air quality, but really when air quality is poor, everyone needs to be aware and pay attention. When it's hot and humid, it's an important time to know what your air quality is like. The website airnow.gov gives you local air quality information and can tell you not only what your air quality is now, but what it is predicted to be during the day. Air quality varies over the course of a day, just like the rest of weather can change. It also varies based on where you are. So there are local changes that affect air quality. One of the things we need is better local air quality measurement. Some states have a lot of it, some states have less. And knowing what things are like near you specifically can help you make plans. If air quality is bad and you can control your outside activities, that's not the time to plan outside activities, specifically higher intensity activities like exercise. You're better off doing them when air quality is better, usually earlier or later in the day, as opposed to the hottest, most humid times of day. Again, we need to educate others and make the connection between climate change and extreme weather, between climate change and air pollution, between climate change and wildfires. We need to all be advocates. We need to know who and to wear my lung association hat at all times. And I tend to talk about climate when my patients are coming in, saying, I have trouble breathing when it's hot and humid. There's a reason that they have trouble breathing when it's hot and humid. And there are things we can do to help affect that. And certainly getting involved with the American Lung Association, where we are doing tremendous work to invest in appropriate advocacy and education and resources can be important. If you go to lung.org/get-involved, you can find out how to get involved with our great organization, both locally or nationally. Next slide. So at this point, I'll open it up to questions. There, I know were some that came through in the chat, and we'll work on addressing those.
Yes. Thanks, Dr. Hill. The first question that came in was from Erica, and it asks, can you share more of why red meat is impacting climate change?
So in general, most of our fertilizers are fossil fuel based. And there's been a green revolution since the 1970s where fertilizers have really enabled us to feed the world, and it's a wonderful thing. But the higher up the food chain an animal is, the more energy it requires to produce that protein and get it to market. So plant-based proteins require much less energy input than meat-based proteins. And the higher up the food chain, chicken, poultry, and fish require less energy than cattle. So in general, the more red meat we're eating and producing, the more climate change gases are released. Simplified answer to that question, but that's essentially the reasons why.
Thank you. The next question we have is, are you familiar with thunderstorm asthma? And have you seen cases you feel are attributed to a recent storm? That's by Kelly C.
So thunderstorm asthma has definitely been described, and it's an interesting phenomenon. One, typically right before thunderstorms, it's often that hot, humid weather with bad air quality. So sometimes the storms, because a front is coming through, actually improve air quality afterwards. The rain washes particles out, temperatures drop, and there's less air pollution. But actually during the thunderstorms themselves, the lightning produces electrical charges that can attach to pollen and other particulates and make them more allergenic. So some patients will describe worsening asthma. I can't think of a recent storm where it's happened, but this is definitely a known phenomenon. We see increased emergency room visits and increased asthma flares around thunderstorms.
Thank you. And then we have another question from an Anne. It says, do you consider chicken and fish meat?
I do. Again, if you want to be the most climate sensitive eater, you'd become a vegetarian or vegan. I am, not saying that is what everyone needs to do, but both poultry and fish have higher climate impacts than a plant-based diet.
Awesome. Thank you. If there's any more questions, you feel free to drop them in the chat. We just have a comment, not necessarily a question. It says livestock also generates methane, which is a greenhouse gas. So that might, answer the question as to why red meat is impacting climate change. But if there's any more questions, anyone feel free to drop them in the chat.
And methane, I didn't talk about a lot during my talk, but livestock production of methane is an issue. Landfills and trash breaking down in landfills is a big source of methane, and natural gas production also can release a lot of methane. Natural gas itself is a climate changing gas. So anytime there's a leak of natural gas, that makes climate change worse. But methane is a byproduct of natural gas production. And if there are not strong controls on its release, it makes climate change worse. It's a climate change gas than carbon dioxide, actually. So it is a big area of concern.
Dr. Hill, another question regarding how you see patients typically deal with the climate change. Do you feel that typically children or elderly adults or adults, which age group do you typically see is more affected by the effects of climate change on their asthma or any other respiratory condition?
Yeah, so I'd say I see it across the board. Our electronic health, we actually had to add a little section because so many patients were coming in complaining about trouble during hot, humid days. And so we ask about that specifically. It gives us an opportunity to talk about climate effects, to talk about things you can do to be safer. So I do see kids, my kids and their parents, I talk about when it's appropriate to exercise outside, because when air quality is bad, it's it's not the time to run around outside, and and that's it. You'd say if it's a nice sunny day, you don't want to have the kid stuck inside in front of a TV set, but there's times where you just don't want to be there. There are also things you can do in your own house I didn't talk about, but certainly there are ways to reduce pollen and air pollution. So if you have air conditioning and air quality is bad, you're better off running it. If you don't have air conditioning, running fans is fine, but you may want to think about HEPA filters to decrease air pollution. And you can run air cleaners that are commercially available. They're not completely inexpensive. There are also ways to make really inexpensive air cleaners just using a house fan and HEPA filters attached to it. And there are online instructions to do that. So you don't have to invest hundreds of dollars in expensive equipment if you want to make a less expensive version on your own. And that can really decrease pollution within your own living space and help people who have asthma and allergies.
Thank you, doctor. And also just building on that question when it comes to like air purifiers, and it's great that there is that option where you can have a fan and putting a filter, inexpensive options, for everyone. But have you seen that now, because asthma is very, person specific regarding their allergens, would you suggest that if someone has a specific allergen, let's say to animal dander or maybe dust mites, that they should have a air purifier or some type of purifier because they have a described allergen? Or would you recommend anyone who has asthma to have an air purifier?
Certainly, if your asthma is not well controlled, doing what you can to control any exposure is important. Pets are always a challenge. So, the last thing that, patient coming in to see me wants to hear me say is you need to get rid of your cat or dog. And I try to avoid that if I can, but cats, even more so than dogs, are very allergenic and can cause significant problems. There are other allergens that are much harder to control. So pollen we can try to avoid, but it's, can't cut down all the trees and get rid of all the plants. That's not particularly good for the environment. Mold and dust mites and things like that, there are some controls you can do within your own house. There are other times even those are hard to avoid. Dust is an endless battle. Mold, depending on where you live and what the weather conditions are, you want to correct areas where there are water leaks, roofs that aren't appropriate, plumbing issues, basements that have high moisture. There are things that can be done to fix that if you have control over those areas. But some of those things can be really hard to avoid, and that's where air purifiers can be beneficial.
Thank you, Dr. Hill. I also see that we have another question on the chat in the chat. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, Sire. As heat increases due to climate change and AC use increases, how much does this contribute further to climate change? Are newer ACs better at minimizing HFCs? Are there better alternatives?
So it's it's a good question. This is a challenge because it does become hotter and air quality gets worse and people run their air conditionings more, which leads to increased electricity use. So part of the response to that is yes, newer, more efficient air conditioners that use less electricity are better than older models. It's kind of like a change in automobiles. You don't want a gas guzzler air conditioner if you can afford something more efficient. Having the electric grid itself be green powered, so more solar energy, more wind energy, more clean energy, rather than burning fossil fuels to run those air conditioning is important. In terms of HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, this goes back to what I talked about with the ozone layer. Those were phased out as part of what was called the Montreal Protocol, which helped fix that hole in the ozone layer. The newer equipment doesn't have the same chemicals. They're much safer. They may not be completely safe, but they're much safer compared to what was available back in 60s, 70s, 80s. And I can See, we've got more questions coming in.
Yeah, awesome. Our other question by Kelly, what practical guidance or research related to climate change and asthma and allergy do you feel is lacking and needed?
So there's a fair amount of data out there. We need more data specific to the effects of air pollution on asthma and allergies in general. The more data we have about both acute and long-term effects, the better we can advocate for policy changes. So there's a lot of research being done in this field. And I talked about air quality monitoring. It's really important that we have local air quality monitoring to know how individual communities are being affected, both by air pollution that's national and by more local pollution being produced on highway corridors or by local industrial facilities.
Great. We do have another question by Lola. Could you offer advice to the most effective methods to initiate community education?
So I think this starts with very small communities and works its way up. So those are your parents. This starts by educating your own family and children. We build the next generation, making sure our kids are aware of what's happening and they become advocates. And then working with in community groups that you're already involved with to talk about this focus and see if there's appropriate programming that can be put on. We all have our own specific communities, whether they're faith-based or interest-based, education-based, or just general community organizations that we can, as I said, walk the walk and talk the talk, wear that climate hat and take the opportunity to educate people. Unfortunately, science has been politicized, and science is really based on evidence, research, and facts. And we should try to avoid making this political, other than in the sense that it does require political action to make those policy changes that are going to address this.
Okay, looks like we have another question from Lori. Could you describe what is happening to the elderly besides the presence of comorbidities that would make this group more susceptible to the effects of climate change?
So comorbidities is a big part of this. In general, the elderly are more likely to have chronic health problems. So vascular disease, cardiac disease, diabetes, and chronic lung disease. The elderly also have lower pulmonary reserve. So unfortunately for all of us, from about the age of 23 on, our lung function starts to decline. It's worse in people who smoke or people are exposed to higher levels of air pollution, but it happens across the board to all of us. And when you start to get up to your 70s and 80s and 90s, you just have less lung reserve, so that when you're exposed to things that cause lung injury, you're more likely to have bad effects from it.
Awesome. We have another question from Marion. How about environmental pollution in municipal buildings and schools? What can be done to improve this?
So part of this requires that advocacy work. Public buildings and schools are areas where, schools, particularly our kids, are spending all day there. And we need to make sure that school boards and educators are aware of pollution issues, particularly outdoor air quality, where kids may be going outside during recess or outside for athletic activities. And we need to be concerned about indoor air pollution in schools. Both schools can be moldy and dusty, which can lead to asthma problems. Radon, which is a separate health issue, can also be elevated in schools. The Lung Association does do advocacy work in this issue. There's also an effort needed to improve ventilation in schools. So both from a mold and particle pollution standpoint, and also from an infection standpoint. School-age kids, unfortunately, are great vectors for things like flu and RSV and COVID, and improving our school ventilation can actually decrease the transmission rate for those diseases.
Awesome. Just two more questions. From Gregory, we have, how do you read the information on air now? When it's read PM 2.5 is good, what does that mean?
So if it says the PM 2.5 is a measurement of particle pollution, so airnow.gov will typically have both a listing for particle pollution and for ozone. PM 2.5 being good means the air quality where you are locally is estimated to be good in terms of particle pollution. It's probably safe for you to exercise outdoors, and and you can live your life normally. As that level changes to the orange, red, they keep adding colors because air quality gets worse. That's where you need to curtail outdoor activities in those settings. And you need to pay attention to both PM 2.5 and ozone. So ozone tends to be the one that increases most with high temperatures and high humidity acutely, whereas particle pollution is more the combustion pollution. We see that a lot when there are fires nearby. Certainly, one of the things I told people last year when we had the effects of wildfires here on the East Coast is, if you can smell the smoke, you don't need to go to airnow.gov. If it's bad enough to smell or see, you don't want to be spending time outside.
Thank you. And a question from Farah. If patients monitor air pollution levels online, what numbers or ranges should one know? Like, what are the red flag numbers to keep an eye out for, especially for patients with asthma?
Yeah, so I think that airnow.gov site is great because it gives you color alerts. Really, from a green is good to red and purple are bad, and orange is be aware of it and pay attention. And a lot of our local forecasts are doing a good job of releasing information, just with the weather forecast and saying this is what the air quality looks like, and you may want to avoid exercising outdoors in the midday hours. I really recommend even that healthy people avoid exercising on bad air quality days outside. So if you have the opportunity to either do indoor exercise or do it earlier and later in the day, that's better than having those acute exposures.
Great, thank you, Dr. Hill. I think those are all the questions so far. A lot of great questions. So thank you everyone for writing those questions in the chat. I'm going to share my screen one more time for just some final notes. And I think you can see you can see my screen. So for some additional resources, we do have our Asthma library resource. So feel free to use your phone for the QR sheet. We have a lot of interactive videos, worksheets, infographics for people with asthma and also their caregivers. And we also do have the QR code to our NYSCI website. So that's the New York State Children's Asthma Initiative website. You can also find a lot of great educational opportunities there, training, school-specific materials and handouts, interactive, a lot of interactive materials there as well. So the one on the left is specifically to the lung.org website, and the one on the right with NYSCI is our NYSCI website. We also have a lot of really great educational opportunities that I really recommend for you to check out if you haven't already. These are our basics courses, a lot of our 1-hour module courses. This is also found at lung.training. So if you just hover your phone again, you can, and this QR code will take you directly to lung.training, where you could see the asthma basics, tobacco basics, infectious respiratory disease basics, and a lot of our other really great courses. These courses are typically about an hour long, and for a lot of them, you do get one continuing education credit, which is great. Lastly, I just wanted to mention really quickly that we are having an Asthma Awareness Month contest. So if you work with folks, with patients, or if you're a community health worker and, of course, at different capacities, you work with patients going to their home, you really are helping them with their health related social needs or social determinants of health. So if you have that experience, feel free to send us a little blurb, about 4 to 6 sentences describing a time where you have helped address these social determinants of health or these health related social needs. And then if you can send that at your earliest convenience, we want to, Asthma Awareness Month is concluding within the next couple of days. So if you can, just please send that to the Nice Guy email, which is written right there, the New York State Children's Asthma Initiative at lung.org. And then we can write you in for hopefully for the raffle so that you can win a prize. So Dr. Hill, is there anything final, anything that you would like to share with our folks on the line?
Nothing specific. I really want to thank everyone who attended virtually. Sorry I didn't get to see all of you. I know you got to see me, but I hope you learned something from this, and I hope you'll take some action to help address this. As I said, just keep this in the forefront of your mind, because as one of my early slides said, this is bad, but there's hope. So we can make things better.
Thank you, Dr. Hill. And thank you so much, Dr. Hill, for such a great presentation. Really learned a lot. It's, there's still hope. I think that's the
That's the big
takeaway message. Yeah, the big takeaway message. There is a lot of things that are happening, but there's definitely hope. And thank you, everyone who participated with their questions. It was really great we had so many great questions. Hopefully in the next couple of days, I will be sending everyone who registered, the link to this presentation if you'd like to share it, and then also a copy of the slides. Well, thank you so much. Thank you again, Dr. Hill, and thank you everyone for joining us in the final webinar series concluding Asthma Awareness Month. We hope you have a really beautiful day. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.